Sometimes you will hear a charge made that Christians fabricated the story of Jesus. Sometimes people will claim that the whole thing is made up, particularly the part about the resurrection. Whenever I hear people make that claim, I always chuckle and I smile a bit because I think it's a rather silly claim. Because when you think about it, if they made up the story of the resurrection to make things look good or convincing, they did a rather poor job. For as we heard tonight, the event of the resurrection, the rising itself of Jesus, is never described. Also, the story is told in the barest of form, with very little elaboration. And it certainly doesn't have any of the details that we really all would like to know. And perhaps the most telling point is the fact that the protagonists in the story, the women who come to the tomb and the apostles who follow in their footsteps, do not come across too well in the story, do they? In Luke's version of the resurrection that we heard tonight, we heard that the women were puzzling about what was said when it was announced to them by those two messengers. And if you recall, the 11 apostles, when they heard the news, first thought that the story seemed like nonsense, and they did not believe them. If one were making up the story of Jesus and his resurrection, wouldn't you try to make yourself look a bit better in the narrative that you told? Frederick Buechner, the noted author and preacher, says that the narrative itself is powerful. There is a ring of authenticity to the telling of the story. He said it is clear that the goal of the story was not necessarily to tell the story convincingly, but rather, even more importantly, they told it truthfully. The story is so precious, so extraordinary, so awesomely wonderful. It's the kind of news that you want to whisper cogently, urging people to come close, to hear all that can be told. And yet, there is that part about the reaction of the protagonists, about the women, and about the apostles that does cause one to pause and to ponder. Why was their reaction to the news of the resurrection one of being puzzled? Why did they not understand like one would think? Shouldn't they have understood? Hadn't Jesus told them about his dying and his rising? The initial confusion and bewilderment of the witnesses does make sense when one remembers what the resurrection truly is. It's not an everyday occurrence. In fact, it's even bolder than that. It's not even a human occurrence. It is a transcendent one. It's an act of God, an act from an entirely different dimension, a dimension beyond the limits of our space and time continuum. No amount of predicting or preparing by Jesus could have readied those first witnesses perfectly for what they were to experience. Even with the gift of faith, the resurrection is an event of such awesome nature that there's no human reality with which to compare it. Keep in mind now, the resurrection is radically transformed life. It's not the resuscitated life of Lazarus, one come back to our life from the dead. It's transformed life, radically transformed. So it's accurate to say that the experience of the resurrection of those first Christians was even beyond words. And that's reflected in the manner in which the first Christians spoke about the resurrection. In the earliest of days, there were no elaborate narratives or theological theories about the resurrection. The first preaching of the apostles was most simple. They proclaimed simply, Christ is risen. No more needed to be said than that. and those simple words were backed by simple deeds. The radically transformed life of the resurrection radically transformed the activity of the apostles and the members of the early church. Fear was replaced by boldness. Peace took the place of dissension. Scattered individuals were gathered into community. Healing was offered to the broken, and those brought low were lifted up. When asked to explain what had changed in their lives, those early Christians simply proclaimed, "Christ is risen." For them, there was no need for more explanation than that. The truth has that kind of effect. There is no need for elucidation or exaggeration. The truth ultimately reveals itself. It simply is. Ultimately, then, what the resurrection calls for is belief, much more than it calls for understanding. Faith can better reveal its mystery than speculation, and commitment can better unleash its power than analysis. With faith and commitment, the veil to the transcendent is lifted, and we are given a glimpse of divine power. Or in biblical terms, with faith and commitment, the stone is rolled back, and the power of risen life is set free. So in faith and commitment, let us this night dedicate ourselves to be about resurrection living. Transformed by the grace of the good news of the resurrection, let us live radically transformed lives, empowered to live boldly, inspired to bring peace, reconciliation, compassion, and justice to a needy world, allowing the simple truth of the resurrection to echo in our own day and time, proclaiming with simplicity, sincerity, and thus most forcefully, Christ is risen.